So thank you for coming in. Let's go ahead and start breaking down this, 3 different viewpoints of hell.
Yeah. Let's do it. Well, basically, I think one of the problems, we were out last night and we were chatting with someone, and I was kind of just trying to highlight to this person, because they were like, well, this is what happens, right? You say the prayer, you go to heaven. You don't say the prayer, you go to hell. And hell is not fun, right? It's burning in your own fat for eternity, and we were just kind of opening up some different ideas. So there's the ideas of, is that just, right? So even at a certain point, you think of the worst person you can think of, everyone always thinks Hitler. I mean, probably, maybe, I don't know. At some point there might have been someone worse, but let's go for Hitler. Hitler killed 6 million Jews. He caused countless deaths and awful scenarios throughout Europe. But at a certain point, let's say 85.2 billion years, has Hitler paid his price? If we're talking about justice, if you should be punished a certain period of time for a certain crime, a life, death, whatever, murder, rape, at a certain point, there's a point where we should start questioning, is this still just? After 800 billion, trillion, gazillion years, is God just being a bit of a vindictive kind of like monster?
Well, and that's the extreme. We could almost accept that as extreme. Yep. The problem is the person working next to you at work or riding on the bus, or
who's actually a better person than you. He just isn't a Christian. We all know that guy.
They're working for the Peace Corps. They've given up their life, but they drink on the weekends, or good person doing good things, but
didn't say the prayer.
Right.
So there's a justice element that we can look at, but there's also the fact that if we are honest with ourselves, so we talk about, well, the Bible says, and I think we've talked about that in some of the other podcasts, like the Bible doesn't say anything black and white. The Bible requires an interpretation, and when you say the Bible says, what you mean is my interpretation of the Bible is. And so many people's interpretation of the Bible is, it says that people will burn forever and ever and ever. But it might not. There's plenty of Bible verses that point to other things, and so we can look at that as well. We'll start unpacking that. But on the whole, I think the biggest thing that we should stop and give us pause is not even those two things. I think those are just from a more ethical point of view of just looking at the ethics of it as the justice. Maybe just looking like, is it ethical that God does that? Is that actually justice? And there may be more from a scriptural, doctrinal point of view, looking at the Bible and what does the Bible say and how should we interpret it. But actually taking a step back and just going, what did people believe throughout the church, throughout history? And when we ask that question, we only find a narrowing of belief to what we have today when we see the Protestant church come on scene. So up until the Protestant church, people believed multiple things about hell. And it's only the Protestant movement that kind of locks down to one belief. And it's largely because they went from different movements in the church, Catholic Church, Orthodox Church, things like that. And some of them, people like Luther and Calvin and these guys thought they were too works focused and they wanted faith alone. Now, when you're going faith alone, what they're saying is you need to believe the right thing. And of course, these core group of people that kind of kick-started the Protestant Reformation, they all believed in this one view of hell. So because they believed in this one view of hell, and it's all about believing the right thing, well, that's the one thing you're allowed to believe. And so the Protestant movement shifted into only believing this view of hell. But you look at the Catholics, you look at the Orthodox, you look at the Coptics, they have different views that are allowed and you can hold within their faith about the afterlife. And this is the way it always was up until that point. And so I think it's important to look at some of these different views. What did people believe in the early church? What did people believe before Jesus? When Jesus shows up on the scene, what did people believe? A lot of people were surprised that there's no mention of hell in the Old Testament. It's not there. You could maybe argue Daniel 12:2. It's a very late text. But even then, it's a bit complicated. And if you actually read it kind of at face value, it's a pretty poor hell text. It's quite a complex one. And so, because these are dead bodies being eaten by worms, they're not fully, it's just a complex text. But my point being, in the Old Testament, there's no writings about hell. And the reason for that is they didn't believe in a hell. So the Jews originally, when we start early Judaism and right up until this kind of Second Temple period, when they came out of Babylon and built their Second Temple about 400 years or so before Jesus showed up, the Jews in that period, up until 400 BC, didn't believe there was a hell. What they believed was when you died, you were worm food. You're done. You just cease to exist. But God would grant immortality to some. And so it was often called conditional immortality as a technical term for what the Jews believed in that window. And you see this in the Psalms, you see it in different places. You see it in, Paul quotes a writer in Romans, and it says, pray that the Lord would grant you immortality. Why is he saying that to Christians, right? Well, he's quoting some Jewish writings. And so the same in the Psalms, David says, Lord, I pray that you would grant me immortality. So they don't have a concept that they're going to live forever and go to hell or heaven. They have a concept that I am a mortal being that God might gift the gift of living forever. Now, I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's what they always believed. And as they were exposed to Zoroastrianism, this religion in Babylon where they had a good god and a bad god who resided over a bad place and a good place, and you would go to that place when you died, that was the religion of that culture, the primary religion of that culture. And so they were exposed to this concept, and that's where we mentioned in another podcast, kind of Satan comes into play, and then there's a hell that Satan's over, and some people might go to this place called hell. And so many of the Jews, by the time they come back into Jerusalem and start rebuilding the temple and reestablishing a nation of Israel, they're bringing that back in to their faith. And so we see a little bit of their faith, this new belief leaking into Judaism. And that's why I mentioned Daniel 12:2. It's a very late text. It's written at the earliest in the midst of this, but probably even later. It's probably even later than a lot of the book of Daniel. And so we see that this faith is starting to change, to shift. Now, that's not to say we should go back to the earliest belief and that's always right. Sometimes the earliest belief is the most wrong, and God's leading us forward and changing what we believe. But it's just highlighting that even the Jews had a couple of different views. And so, Jesus shows up on the scene and there's already a few different ideas at play. There's probably some other ideas as well of universalism, kind of concept of everyone will be granted immortality and things like that. There's some early Jewish writings that highlight that could have been a possibility within some Jewish sects. Our problem is we don't really understand Judaism. It's only since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered that we found out that Judaism wasn't this one cohesive group. So up until the Dead Sea Scrolls were really studied, we used to think the Jews all believed the same thing. Jesus came up, pointed out they were wrong. Paul said the Jews are over there and we're over here. And that's how most people teach things. They even the grace message is taught like, well, the Jews believed this and we're actually believing this. And that's not a very fair way to frame things. Since the Dead Scrolls were discovered, we've discovered there's dozens of different ideas and theologies within Judaism, and different people held different ideas, and they kind of stuck to different concepts. And so all that to say, the Jews had lots of different views. And so when Jesus comes on the scene and starts talking about hell, he's engaging with that. A lot of the time we're
trying to meet the people where they're at based on their beliefs.
We're assuming certain things, but we need to know, there's different ideas flowing at place here. So we need to know who's he talking to, what group is he talking to. Pharisees, they believed in an afterlife. Sadducees, overwhelmingly, the Sadducees and the scribes didn't believe in an afterlife. They believed that it was in conditional immortality at best. But some of them didn't even believe that. They just believed that you're done. And so there's all sorts of things. You see this when some guy, one of the Sadducees comes to Jesus and says, hey, Jesus, if the afterlife's real, well, when you die and then your brother marries your wife and then he dies and then his brother marries your wife and then the wife dies, well, who's she married to, And he's kind of tricking Jesus going like, if there's an afterlife, what? Is your wife going to have 5 husbands? Because that's an anathema to a Jew. Right. A husband might have 5 wives, but a wife would never have 5 husbands. That's not okay. And because it's possession, right? We own the woman, not the other way around. And Jesus kind of is messing with them, right? So when Jesus responds, he's not necessarily saying this is how heaven will work, but he's just saying, what are you talking about? You're talking about a natural carnal thing like marriage, as though that's the way that eternity works. And so he's kind of deconstructing their kind of concept of that. So we see this constantly in the way that Jesus talks about the afterlife, and we see it constantly when he mentions the word that we associate as hell. So the word that we associate hell, Jesus usually uses the word Gehenna, which is a place in Jerusalem. So Gehenna was a valley that was right down the middle of Jerusalem. And you can go there today. It's a beautiful, lush, green valley. It's called the Valley of Hinnom, but Gehenna was the Greek word for that. But it has a history. It has a real history. So the Valley of Hinnom is the place where they burned all the children that they gave up to sacrifices. And then all the people that were involved in child sacrifices, they were thrown into the Valley of Hinnom and killed. They were killed and set on fire, and they would be burned, some of them alive, some of them dead, just set on fire. And so this Valley of Hinnom was a place of death. It was a place of fire. It was a place of judgment. You do this, you're going to burn in the valley. And so when we see Jesus talk about Gehenna and we see the word hell, we need to be aware, well, this is a word that has real, very significant meaning to a Jew that's sitting in Jerusalem. And he's saying, hey, if you keep rebelling against the Romans, you're going to burn in the valley of Gehenna. What's he saying there? He might just be saying, if you rebel against the Romans, you're going to burn in the valley of Gehenna. It's possible. He might also be saying, hey, if you keep rebelling in Rome, God's going to judge you as a rebellious person, as someone that doesn't submit, as someone that isn't about love, and he'll burn you forever and ever for eternity in a place called hell. That's possible as well, but I think we should at least associate the most simplistic, in-context reading as the most likely before we jump to any kind of like more broad metaphysical kind of concepts.
Right. If I was talking to somebody, I would probably say, man, if you do that, you're going to go to prison because we have a prison system.
Absolutely.
I probably would not say, man, if you keep on doing that, we're going to send you to Mars.
Right.
That's what the kind of the concept is there.
Yeah.
Something that hasn't been achieved yet, but we're going to do it,
Yeah.
And you're like, well, what's Mars? Well, what would that be like? Well, when do I, there's not even a structure or system to go to Mars, but I'm demanding that you can't because you're going to go there. So that's, that's kind of in context what you're talking about with, Jesus referring to what was modern day.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure in every town, there's a place that's the bad part of town or the area you like, all the trash ends up getting dumped there when people like just dump their couch instead of taking it to the skip or, and it's like, that was it was a place that just was, it's beautiful today. You go there and it's like gorgeous, but that's because we've grown up slightly. We don't burn bodies and we don't dump couches as much, But back in the day, it was just a trash heap. It was just horrific. And it had this association. It was so awful. And so I think it's really important we read things in context in that way. And so all that to say that Jesus doesn't really talk about quote unquote what we call hell all that much. A lot of time we go, well, Jesus mentioned hell, this many times, and you go, yeah, but go look at them in context. How many of them was he talking about a literal afterlife place? And when we look at when he's talking about the afterlife, we then go, okay, well, how literally are we taking that? So we talked about the passage in Matthew, I think yesterday on one of the podcasts, and we were saying, it talks about the goats and the sheep being separated, goats and the sheep being separated, and the goats will go and be, eternally destroyed, and the sheep will reign in heaven. And we take that literal, right? We go, yeah, okay, well, there's an afterlife passage we can take literally. But then we don't actually take it literally, because what did it say? It says, people that love the poor and the homeless and the helpless, they're the sheep. They get to live forever. People that don't love the poor and the helpless, they're going to burn forever. That's not how we do the afterlife. We do the afterlife based on praying a prayer or, whatever, accepting Jesus into your heart or coming to the front in an altar call. So we take one part of the passage very seriously, very literally, which is funny because it's the abstract part, right? And then we take the very literal part where Jesus says, hey, if you go help a homeless person, you're helping God and he's going to reward you for it. That part we go, well, it's probably just kind of a little bit abstract. We shouldn't take it too seriously. Because at the end of the day, right, an afterlife is quite easy to put to the side and assume we're going to be better off for it. But actually, we're going to have to go help some homeless people because I walk past some homeless people every now and again, right? So if I'm going to take that seriously, that's going to change my life very much right now.
Like, is it every time I see a homeless, or is it just once a month? Or
is God only in every fourth homeless person? Or right? Because the truth is, if it was genuinely God in the flesh, just sitting there on the floor, right? If you were walking past and it was literally Jesus, whichever Jesus you picture, maybe American Jesus with the long hair, white skin, beard, tunic, socks and sandals, if that's Jesus on the floor every time, and he's like, beloved Ben, it's me, Jesus. Do you have $1? Or could you buy me a sandwich? You get him $1 and a sandwich every time, right? But when it's that smelly kind of homeless person that you don't really, well, are they using drugs? And all this stuff, we don't go, this is God. We go, well, yeah. And so I'm not wanting to make it a topic about, how we look after the poor, but my point is, in that passage, we ignore the very, very clear-cut literal part of the text,
Right.
and we make it all about the abstract part, that, well, what is it? Like, is he actually going to, like, are we goats? Are we sheep? You know, no.
Well, and to think about it, if we took
analogy.
the one part literal where he's talking about helping people, there would be no homeless because everybody would be helping homeless.
Absolutely.
You know, if we really genuinely thought that this was how you make it to heaven, but we don't, we obscure that part off to the side and say, you don't have to help homeless. Just say a prayer.
That's
Just
it.
come to church. We'll take care of you. It's not about the homeless. It's about donating your money and time to the church.
Yeah. It's